thought it was the same thing. I didn't. It was too
Hello,
simple.
everybody. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us here today for what is evidently an important topic for a lot of people. I am Sally Grant, and I'm the art exhibits curator here at the library. We're also joined by Ellen, our library director, relatively new library director, here than less than a year. She's doing filming the talk, so it will be available later. It's not being live streamed, but we will put it on our Facebook page. So I will get round to introducing our distinguished panel. But first of all, I just wanted to say that this panel discussion has come from our current exhibition that you're surrounded by at the moment. It's called Port and Harbour, Preservation, Not Speculation, and it's by the artist Sabina Streeter, who is one of our distinguished panel members. So I just want to give a little plug about the exhibitions and what our intentions are with these. Just like any artworks, the exhibitions are created in a vacuum. And we want to create exhibitions that have subject matter that is of interest and of importance for our local communities as the local library. So when Sabina came to me with this idea that she wanted to have a show that questioned what does historic preservation mean, how important to us is it, how does new development fit into our historic villages. I thought it was a great idea. It's obviously a really hot topic at the moment, although really living in historic villages, I guess it's an evergreen topic as well. So just wanted to give a little bit of a slight overview of some of the images. You'll see that alongside certain images of demolition and destruction, such as boarded up buildings, you have dumpsters in the back, cranes. Alongside that, we also have portraits of figures who were important for a number of historical buildings in Greenport. So at the end, we have Manuel Claudio of the famous Claudio's Tavern. We have Samuel Wells Phillips here, and tucked away in this niche is Albertson Case. And apologies, our light, the bulb just went out just recently, so it's usually spotlit a lot better. And not to dismiss the men, but we're actually very excited that Sabina also created three portraits of women who were instrumental for the architectural and cultural heritage of Greenport. So next to Manuel Claudio, we have Margaret Ireland, and she donated her family home to Stirling Historical Society, which is down in the village. We have on this wall, this is Sarah Adams, and she was a suffragette who founded the Greenport Auditorium, which is at the moment a furniture store on Main Street. I'm sure lots of you know that famous building. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Grace Floyd, who is the founder of our very own library. So we're very excited.
Who made the sketches?
Sabina. The artist Sabina Streeter. I'm going to hand over to Kevin as our moderator, but I just wanted to give a little introduction to everyone. So we have the artist Sabina Streeter. She was born in Munich, Germany, to a family of artists, and her father was an architect, a modernist, but he restored a traditional family farmhouse in the Bavarian Alps. So there's that kind of nice, juxtaposition between the modern and the new, or the old. So Sabina has lived and worked in Sag Harbor since 1992, and her portraits and architectural drawings are based on classical tradition, and her work dramatizes issues of history, popular culture, and most recently, this tussle between building preservation and new development. So she has exhibited her work locally, in NYC, and internationally. And Alana Heiss, the founder of MoMA PS1, said, in quite a compliment, she said of Sabina, "If I had to choose one living artist to distill my likeness on canvas, it would be her." And our next panelist is Tara Cubie. And so we're very honoured. Tara is the Preservation Director of Preservation Long Island, and she has had over 15 years of experience in the historic preservation field. She graduated from Columbia University with master's degrees in historic preservation and urban planning. And she's been at Preservation Long Island just since July, but prior to that she worked for an environmental consulting firm, the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., and another non-profit organization. And Tara is a local. She lives in Matatuck on the North. And we have Maziar Behrooz, who is the founder and architect of MB Architecture, which is an award-winning architecture, design and consulting firm, also based in Sag Harbor and Manhattan. Maziar was born in Iran and moved to Massachusetts when he was 16. He subsequently graduated from Tulane and Cornell Schools of Architecture and Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. Maziar started his architectural practice on the East End in 1996, and he's since designed and built a range of buildings, so from low-cost prefabricated houses to custom-crafted private residences. And he served as a guest curator at the Parish Art Museum, as advisory board member of the Tulane School of Architecture, and as past president of the AIA Economy. And he also built the first green roof in Montauk. And Maziar did say that I should note that he is not an expert in preservation, but he admires authentic historic buildings and the culture and the way they life they enjoy. And it was important for us when we were trying to figure out who could be on our panel. We wanted to have that balance between it's about historic preservation, but it's also considering how new development fit into our historic villages. So finally, we have our panel moderator, Kevin Stuessi. Many of you will know Kevin as the relatively new Greenport mayor, a position that Kevin was elected to this past spring. Kevin grew up in Northern California. He later moved to Sun Valley, Idaho, where he raised his daughters, and then he moved to New York City and finally Greenport. So one of Greenport Village's primary initiatives during Kevin's term so far, I would say, has been to implement a building moratorium. And this was to address the problem of overdevelopment, and so that the community could kind of take a pause, a moment to decide what they wanted their village to be like and look like. So Kevin does also have a background in real estate development, and so he therefore seemed like the ideal moderator for a panel which is about historic preservation, but is also one that attempts to address how new development fits into the fabric of the East End's historic villages. Thank you. I will pass it over to Kevin.
Wonderful.
And I should say, we have come up with some questions to kind of get the ball rolling, and the panelists have some images that might help with the discussion, but there will be plenty of time for audience questions and suggestions.
And I will try to stick to the coaching you gave me. Firstly, thank you everybody for being here. It is so wonderful to see such a large crowd. We're really gifted to have this very special library in the village. Welcome, Ellen. It's lovely having you as part of our community now. And Sally, you are a true gift to Greenport, and you've done such a wonderful job with the library, curating exhibits. The yarn storming was fantastic, and I know you've got some other great ones too. With that, let's roll right into this. And Sabina, I would love to hear how you came up with this study. If you could tell us a little bit about the exhibit and your motivation for it and the story behind it.
And motivation and the story. So, can everybody hear me back?
Yeah.
Yes. I also just some friends from Sag Harbor brave the waves and rise. Hope you can hear me. I lived in Sag Harbor since '92 in an old whaler's house from 1828, and I was always very invested in the history, and consequently did a show of portraiture for the Whaling Museum of the characters, whalers, mariners, their wives, the crews at the Whaling Museum for, it was several shows, it was 2 or 3 shows. And during COVID I was asked by the library if I would do the same for the Greenport history, and I think that was the end of COVID anyway. There were delays, and I did research and wanted to start, and simultaneously to that, the development and also the destruction of historical houses in Sag Harbor has accelerated at such a speed that often it was a wake-up call that I thought, I mean, it's wonderful portraits of great mariners is a wonderful idea, but right now there are more pressing issues. What about the architecture of the houses, the preservation of that? And I'm not a writer and I'm not a filmmaker, although there's some footage of ongoing which myself and a friend who's also on it have been taken ongoing. So in the last year, it just has become insufferable. So I met with Sally again. I said, I think we're changing that. It should be about the preservation of, in general, of historic houses, and also a comparison between, that's why it's called port and harbor, between Greenport and Sag Harbor, because unfortunately, I think in Sag Harbor, the horse is out of the barn, and Greenport has such a big inventory of wonderful houses that are still intact and undisturbed, and that it's almost a little bit of a warning, or if I presumptuously may say so, because the histories have been similar of these two maritime villages in such that they both had working harbors. Greenport still has its working harbor, but the danger, and as it has progressed in Sag Harbor, where the big developers are really there, there's no more.
That is so true, and such a great point.
In such a,
yeah.
and there is with so much means and absolutely no interest in any neither affordable housing or sustainable building. So I felt passionate about it, and I thought, well, I can't write, I can't make films, but I can draw. So.
Well, thank you so much for being here. There's another woman from the South Fork by the name of Jane Merring, who some of you might know from her Build in Kind website and Instagram posts. She was here last year and said, I'm coming to you from your future, as you are from our future as well. And what is an average $3.5 million house in Sag Harbor, we're going to be there in a very short course.
She's fantastic. She's real for us. She's now promoted on the CBA in East Hampton. She has an Instagram page, Built in Kind, but she really focuses on the East End.
Or East Hampton.
Or East Hampton, yeah. She doesn't even take on Sag Harbor because it's so overwhelming. So.
But I think it's important to think about what our future is as a community,
yes.
and where we're going to go, and all we need to do is look across the water to see what's happening with the combination of
yes.
money and development.
Yes.
Sabina, Kevin, just Sabina, do you want to mention about the
I
images
didn't know that's all
also
going on in the back.
Yeah,
okay, so this is a good example. This was one of my favorite houses. It's an 1840s Greek revival. It was built by Colonel Johnson or Jackson, I should know now. In the 1840s, he founded the president, a local paper before the Sag Harbor Express. There is the Sag Harbor corrector, exactly, Hunt and Johnson. So this house, but as long as I'm in Sag Harbor since '92, has always been lovingly maintained. I always loved that port. Eventually it was sold probably 2 years ago, and what is happening now, and here you see the description, it has a full base 7 foot feet, so it was really an important building in the village. And if we move on, well, yeah, you see Sally, is that the interior of the staircase? Okay, anyway, that's what it looks now. This was a house that didn't need to be gutted. It wasn't, this is what's going on as we speak. We also have it here on the if you have time later to look at the monitor. A friend of mine, James Nikki, she filmed it, I filmed it, it's ongoing. That's, when you go down Madison Street, that's what you see. And yeah, that's how it was before. So, and the permits, it's all there. It's all the clear cutting, and that could have been preserved.
So Tara, this is a good point to bring you in. You've obviously spent your career working with the environment and historic preservation, and we're lucky to have you living in our community and heading up the efforts of Preserve Long Island. Tell us a little bit about that and how communities should be looking at trying to preserve their history.
Sure. Maybe this might take a good time to for the slides. So Preservation Long Island, we're located in Cold Spring Harbor. We were founded in 1948 as the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities, so SPLIA, which so you may have heard us under our
Tara, do you want to come over and go through the slides at the same time? Or?
preservation nonprofits in the country, not just in the region.
So,
There you go. And so, our mission, we have advocacy and preservation, which is me. We have education, and we also have a museum curatorship as well. We have 4 historic properties that we maintain, one of which is the Custom House in Sag Harbor, which you might be familiar with. And this is the work we do. So we really do work all over Long Island. These are advocacy projects we've been involved with over the last 20 years or 10 years. And really we stretch from the city all the way out to Montauk or Orient, whichever you feel is the end. As part of that, this is probably our most successful program, I would say. Every other year we do an endangered historic places list. This list is not something that we come up with on our own. We solicit nominations from individuals and historical societies around the island. People nominate buildings, and then there's a subcommittee of experts that needs to decide on the list. And this is how we determine our advocacy priorities. And once it's on the list, it doesn't come off. So one of the projects I've been the busiest with lately is from our 2010 list, which is St. Paul's School in Garden City. But on the east end, we have 12 structures. We've had 44 listed since 2010, and only 3 of them have been demolished. And so it's really been a successful tool for creating connections between people that are interested in these buildings that may not even know that they're endangered, finding grant opportunities, finding other paths forward, and attention for these buildings. So here in Greenport, of course, we have the Greenport Auditorium, which if you haven't had the opportunity to be inside is as significant for its interior as exterior, and is really, has the opportunity to be a community center and a community space for the entire community. Its loss would just be tremendous. We have Fordham Mill, which this one was actually also one of our preservation awards due to its restoration.
that's in Santa Maria, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Oh, it's beyond, right.
It's beyond. So we have, yes, these are other ones, so Sacred Heart Church in Ketchaw, Canoe Place, which is another one that was restored. And so actually out of these, several of them, have seen big improvements since they were listed. The bottom right, this is our new one in Riverhead, the Perkins electric generator. And so if you go to our website, you can find out a lot more about all of these buildings, and also the paths between when they were listed to successful restoration. And we use that really as a template for other structures that come to our attention. So that's a lot about what we do. But really what I'd like to get across is that successful preservation is local preservation. It doesn't happen at the national level. It doesn't happen even at the regional level. It happens in your community. And where that is most clear, so who here thinks the National Register listing protects a building from being demolished?
Being demolished.
From being demolished, from really anything happening to it? It doesn't, a state listing doesn't do that. The only thing that will do that is if your community has local landmark legislation that will protect its historic resources. And even that's not perfect, as we've seen in places like Sag Harbor, but it is the best tool that we have right now. Now, on the East End, several of the communities, including Sag Harbor, Greenport, are CLGs. They're recognized for having very good local landmark laws. And then South Pole and Riverhead they also have protection. They're not quite at the CLG level, but a lot of communities on Long Island don't have that, and that's where you see the most damage and the most demolition. So you have these tools already. We have to use them. So, unfortunately, and this is, then I'll pass it back to you. Unfortunately, in a lot of places, like the Hamptons, some of these, unless the fines are so prohibitive that they'll prevent demolition, they're almost just seen as an extra thing that developers have to pay to get done what they want to get done, and so it doesn't prevent everything from happening. But it is the best tool that we have.
Great, well, thank you so much. Do you want to join us back over
Yeah,
here?
I'm
Maybe we
gonna-
can flip the lights back up. Obviously a very important subject matter, and you come with a significant amount of expertise. One of the things that's so important is to look at what your historic district is.
Yes.
And when one looks at a place like Sag Harbor, the vast majority of Sag Harbor is protected under a historic district, which is not the case in the village of Greenport. I've got some maps here I'll be glad to share with the community at the end, and you'll see that less than a third of our village is protected with historic preservation, which is something that we as a community need to look at much more clearly. I believe I saw Jane, who is head of our historic board here in attendance, who I'm thrilled to say was in front of the village administration and your voted representatives a few months ago, having a discussion about increasing our historic district, which I personally feel is very important for our village. There was an effort several years back to protect the remainder of Front Street, which doesn't sit in the historic district at all, the vast majority of Front Street, which failed, and that's something that we need to take a look at. As a community, we're really fortunate that the community stepped up and we were able to, number one, preserve the movie theater and purchase it as a community through 501c3, and there'd be further efforts to protect it. I think the auditorium is another great example of a place the community cares about deeply. The theater just got a $385,000 grant to go towards further restoration efforts, and I'm also pleased to share that there was a $250,000 grant awarded to a group that is working on purchasing the auditorium, doing some restoration work there too. That being said, the very important thing you mentioned is there is no protection for the interior, so if it were to sell, the interiors could be
All
gutted.
the examples in Sag Harbor are in the historic district. There is also no protection so far against covering. There's so many variances at the moment in place that people get away with building enormous additions on tiny lots.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the only way to truly protect an interior is for the owner of the property to take those efforts, correct?
That is true, although you can rewrite an ordinance to include interiors. And so that would be one other way of covering it. So it can be done at the individual level or at the town level.
So one of the things we're also here to talk about is how do you balance historic preservation with creating new buildings within a historic area, and Greenport has a number of examples where you might have an empty lot or soon to be empty lot next to a historic building. This is something I know you have experience with. If you could tell us a little bit about that and your work that you've done in Sag Harbor, please.
Just one thing about what we just talked about, the demolition of a historic building in Sag Harbor has a fine of a few $100s. So, as much as it's within a historic district, the buildings are landmarked per se, and you could purchase a historic building like the one Sabina showed, and not have it there, not even have a permit to demolish it, but overnight it'll get demolished, and a fee will be paid. Now, to build a new building in its place, you have to go through the ARBs and the various boards, and they will, if you did such a thing, you would probably have a very good lawyer on your, advocating for you. And the boards very often end up somehow negotiating with you, and it's not always the case that you tear a building down and the board will force you, require that you build the same structure in kind exactly. That doesn't always happen, because there's a back and forth, there's, threats of lawsuits, and so very often, regardless of what's in the books and what the code says, developers can tend to get away with, to some extent, with what they want to do. The other thing that, this is where I might, perhaps have a slightly different perspective than some of us on this panel, and that's maybe where I come in. I had an office in East Hampton Village for about 20 years, and East Hampton Village has done like Main Street and Newtown Lane, the core of the village, has done a really good job of preserving the buildings that are there now. According to my friend David Rattray, who is the editor of the Star, he says that only one building there is historic. But nevertheless, the look and feel of the traditional village has been kept. And I know this because I was working there every day. But behind these beautiful historic facades, the buildings are, many of them, owned by multinational corporations. And so we don't see the same people working in the stores. The staff changes all the time. You don't run into the same people over and over again. You don't have a sense of community. The residents of East Hampton Township don't come to the village that much at all, because how many Gucci bags and Louis Vuitton dresses and can you buy? So it's a village that's kind of avoided by the rest of the town, yet the historic look has been maintained. And I want to say something about what happens behind these facades and the buildings, that the way of life is something that should be preserved, or at least advocated for. That way of life where a family would live in a 1,300 square foot home for generations and be able to live sometimes, with bare necessities, sometimes more than that, but not with a sense of excess all the time. And I think that should be part of the discussion, because if you lose the lifestyle, the way of living that supported the kind of small salt boxes that we had, like in the past, then you're just creating a still life museum of historic buildings. But you're still driving the big cars, and maybe the home is owned by an LLC that also owns 20 other homes, and so the sense of community and that nurturing doesn't necessarily get preserved by preserving a building.
So what do you need to look at, though, if you have an empty lot between two beautiful historic homes? And
Well,
how should that fit into it?
One, it depends if you're in the historic district or not.
If you're in the historic district.
So if you're in the historic district, and whether Sag Harbor or East Hampton, and like, for example, the Amagansett Village, you have to go through the ARB. And the ARB the Architectural Review Board, they'll require you, if you're working in the historic district, to create a building that, according to them, maintains that kind of what they call the vernacular, the types of built farmhouse Amagansett buildings that have been around for a while. If you come in with a kind of a modern structure, flat roof, or floor to ceiling glass, wall to wall glass, it will get rejected. So that's in terms of the code. And Sag Harbor Village in itself, depending on where, that also exists, but as Sabina knows very well, and some of our friends from Sag Harbor here know well, people tend to get away with doing not necessarily following the spirit of the code, which is to maintain the kind of historic fabric, let's say. And what should you do if you ask me as an architect and there was no code at all? I would say the idea of, and this is my personal opinion, I know that everyone here has a different idea about this. I'm not saying this is a kind of a rule that should be followed, but it's really just my sense that if I'm building between two historic structures, I want to be sensitive to what's near me. I want to kind of have a sense of scale and size. To me, it's more important that the size relates to what's nearby it and not necessarily the gingerbread detailing of it, because also that becomes expensive to do, and when you do it cheaply, it's really terrible. When you have like a plastic kind of like gingerbread detail on a house. So I'd say the size and scale matters a lot. Materials matter, natural materials more than artificial. I don't want to hog the conversation here, but we can come back to this.
And do you feel like the added review of an architectural review board is helpful in these instances?
I have
And how might
always
it
had
also
a
be
problem.
challenging?
I've always had a problem with ARVs because I feel, again, personal, anecdotal, that historically they've been a way to prevent certain types of buildings and perhaps demographics to enter a place. When you, because of this, if you have a kind of a mandate in the code that says buildings must be appropriate, they must be appropriate to the neighborhood. What you think is appropriate, and you think is appropriate, and you think very different. And so it's a way for whoever is on the board to state their very personal opinion on a matter that really affects everyone. And so I feel like those types of code statements are a way to generate at best confusion. If you said, no, you must use red only, and every picket fence must be painted white, every double hung window, every window has to be a double hung, divided like, that's okay. But if you use the word appropriate, I find that to be really complicated.
And then how does Preservation of Long Island look at this? And what guidance have you seen through state parks, national parks, if you have a wonderful historic structure that needs to be brought up to modern times, or maybe some sort of expansion that's required as part of it?
Right. Well, I might.
ADA accessibility.
Absolutely. I might just take one quick step back and actually support a lot of what you just said. And if you go to what we use as our guidance umbrella, what's known as the Secretary of Interior Standards, and they actually have guidance for what new construction should look like in a historic district. And this is not saying that every ARB follows this guidance, but what you said is exactly right. The scale, the basic massing of the buildings, that's really what's the most important thing. I would add a second thing in that when designing the modern addition, that building should not be the shining star. So the historic buildings within that district should still be allowed to shine brightest. And so some places address that by creating what are known as design guidelines, where they do exactly what you're talking about. So all the shutters are red, or they can put in there whatever they want. Some of them are done very successfully and have provided very clear guidance for great development. Some of them are awful, and they result in exactly what we were talking about, these cookie cutter, Disney-like, facade type historic structures that really in the end take away from the historic building. my preference would be that you just had to, be a certain quality architect, and then you could design what you wanted within that sort of space, and you'd come up with these brilliant things. But unfortunately, there are a lot of bad developers and architects in the world, so you can't just give that blanket sort of.
This table excluded.
I was absolutely
You were gonna say
not
that.
including you in that group of bad
Just
architects.
kidding.
Well, so
I've
one-
seen your work.
One thing that's interesting I'd like to talk to everybody about, especially on a day like today, where we're really facing a huge climate change issue with the rising sea levels. And, I talk to people that have been in the village a lot longer than I have, and today was certainly one of the highest days of water we've seen in a very long time. And there's a lot being done at looking at the ability to potentially raise houses up in order to preserve them. And then, of course, there's a somewhat more controversial issue that Montauk, the hamlet of Montauk is going through in the town of East Hampton right now as part of their resiliency plan, which is managed retreat. And literally looking at taking the hotels that are on the beach. And if you look at photos from this week, the water is up at the edge of them and moving them back. But architects are also taking advantage of this, and I've seen it in Sag Harbor where houses are being lifted up, but at the same time, what they're doing is they're creating these massive new spaces that don't really fall under the guidelines to build, whether it's an underground pool or gym or whatever else.
You mean the glass houses, the Alfgate houses, when you come over the North Haven Bridge? It looks like
You've seen
Miami.
it's
I
offensive
look
to
at it
many.
every day.
We have a few in our village that
How,
have been
how
created.
did that happen?
How do you deal with that?
Well, the issue is really complex, because, so many private, private property ownership laws come into play. And, there aren't that many public, there isn't a legislation that right now I think on the east end, at least South Fork, that will require you to retreat, whether from, near bay properties or ocean property. There are setback laws, 100 foot, 150 feet from wetlands, but the idea of tearing an oceanfront house completely down and transferring that development right to another inland parcel, that doesn't, even though we proposed that to the town 20 years ago in the AIA, that group that we were all in, it didn't go anywhere.
But what about raising them and creating new space? Should that be?
Well, so one thing that's important is that if land is left in its more or less natural state, so it can absorb water and do the whole natural regeneration that it can do naturally, that's a great thing. And the more land surface is unpaved, uncovered, and can remain porous, so water can just drain into the ground versus being pushed out into the streets, the better it is. Now, when you raise a home and you put a parking slab under it, I guess that protects your house in case there's a flood, but it doesn't help with water drainage. And I'm having that issue around the corner from my house in Sag Harbor Village, where a developer has come into possibly the most flood-prone part of Sag Harbor, where the groundwater is this much under the surface of the streets, and proposing initially 100,000 square foot development, and now reduced it to 70,000 square feet. So it's proposing a 70,000 square foot development in an area where we should retreat. And he's not even considering raising.
And that's in the historic district,
That's
correct?
inside, well within the historic.
Yeah.
And they're not raising them. In Biloxi, Mississippi, there's places down south, along the Gulf, where you'll drive down a road, every house is raised. And they're protecting their homes. And it might be, there might come a time where many homes here will do that too, because they're not gonna just give up their land and move.
So how did those large glass condominiums get built on the water in Sag Harbor?
Oh, that's a
Historic
long,
district?
that's a long,
But it's a good good point, because
Disagree.
it's a historic district and somehow it was allowed to get through.
Well,
And
one thing anecdotally, there was before a not very attractive building, which was built by the lawyer who invented 1-800 lawsuit or something like that. And it was sort of what you could only describe as, I don't know, his bizarre postmodern fantasy dream house. And he had a cupola on the top that was totally useless. And there were rumors, I remember, my daughter was still in elementary school, he has wild animals in there. So I mean, it was this mysterious building, but anyway, the developers took this cupola and just took that as the actual height of the building. So that's how they got the variance, and the ARB or the ZBA or the mayor asleep at the wheel and didn't catch that. So that's why they were able to go up 3 stories,
Yeah.
right?
Yes,
That's
I
one
mean,
of the
there's-
stories.
Also, there was a donation of, there was
A trade.
a donation to create the John Steinbeck Park, which is
Yeah.
about this
Yeah.
big. And that is another little trapdoor through which they go.
Yeah.
I'm a philanthropist, and therefore, all
Yeah,
of this
yeah.
other stuff is waived.
It was a trade, that this cupola on top really was just a dome on a 2-story building. And the trade was, I'll give you this land, turn it into Steinbeck Park, and kind of ignore that I'm gonna add a 3rd floor. And that happened.
so I'm gonna speak on behalf of the voted representatives of the village, and I'm one of 5 voices. And if this is something that all of you care about, please come to the village meetings and demand we take some action, because literally less than 1/3 of our village is protected. And there's a house that went up in my neighborhood, and people said, oh my God, how could this happen? It looks like this or that, it's page 4 of the Wayfair catalog. You know, it should have been built to look like the neighborhood. Well, there are no design standards in my neighborhood. And there isn't in the vast majority of the village, and that's something that we want to truly try and protect the character of this community. It's something we need to look at as a community, because we have great history here. And, you know, the auditorium is a perfect example. It is something that sits within the historic district, but, you know, as we talked about, the interior could change tomorrow.
And there's one more thing that is missing in all of these towns, which is, to an architect, really surprising. Because we've been trained and we see all the time, urban or village plans, or what they call vision plans, or comprehensive plans, where a community gets together and decides what their town should look like 10 years from now, 20, 40, 50 years. And there's drawings of what a maximum build-out would look like. And you then discuss that. You all sit around and say, no, that historic building is in the way, like we need to move it, or because of X, Y, Z, but you also allow in a managed way where new buildings can go, because if you don't put new buildings up, the community won't survive. But there are no comprehensive plans. There's none in East Hampton now, none in there's not Sag Harbor. I don't know if Greenport has one. And we keep saying, why don't you hire, or you put up a competition, something where you come up with a vision plan with the community, you know, putting up a board, writing down what people want, coming back, presenting it to the community, changing it again. And so it ends up that zoning is done through individual applications at a board. So you just show up, and then you have this fight with the board members, and you just try to get away with as much as you can.
No, it's a great point, and we're in the process of working through an update to our LWRP, which is our comprehensive plan, because we are truly just 1 square mile. And actually 2 nights ago, we did a big group event with the community looking at affordable housing and what we wanted housing to look like in the community. And had about 75 people that were identifying different things and making comments. That's an important subject, affordable housing.
Yes.
I'd be curious of your perspective and what you've seen in your experience, what works and what doesn't. And
Well, historic buildings are ideal sites often for historical or for affordable housing, apartments above stores in places like Greenport. And unfortunately, federal policy, state policy, so if you look at HUD, until very recently, a lot of those policies went against, creating affordable housing in historic buildings because there wasn't the financial support to do so. It was cheaper to build, you know, a new, place outside of town or do something. That's changing. So if you go on HUD's website, there's been a slow realization that, working with main streets and working within historic districts, that this is a place where affordable housing should happen.
Yeah, it's changed pretty dramatically in
It
the
has.
recent past couple of years.
It really
There's
has. And
a good amount of tax breaks, and if you start looking at doing housing
Exactly.
above or with commercial in historic districts, there's some significant advantages.
And that wasn't true until recently, so this is really a time to take advantage of those kind of opportunities. That being said, new affordable housing can also be built, I think, as long as it's sympathetic and compatible. We don't want places like Greenport to just become, you know, tourist destinations. It should be a place where the people that, have lived here for generations can continue to stay. So.
Great, should we open it up to audience questions, Sally?
Yeah.
Does anybody have a question? You'd like to, yes,
I
Margaret?
have a question for, I don't remember your name,
Maziar.
but Maziar, the point that you made about the facade,
Yeah.
and then behind it,
Yeah.
and then all of the wealth and everything else.
Yeah,
I mean, that has to do with people selling their houses and buildings to make money.
yes.
I mean, it's the stupid, it's the system,
Yes,
so how can
yes.
we, to me, that's like
Yes.
why we're in such trouble because of
Yes.
that. So, you have any ideas on how to?
Well, we all have ideas, right? And there was a point, and maybe like sometime around 2 decades ago, owning a home here became a real estate investment. I mean, it always was to some extent. It was your, you know, the home that you would have, but then it became something you do to make more money. And that really changed everything, because then people were buying homes in order to sell them. And by doing whatever, renovate, expand, you have to do something to them, you know, and so this cycle is gonna continue, and I'm in no illusion. I mean, I don't think there's a way to stop it. I don't know, maybe somebody, economist would have an idea of this, man. I personally don't know how to. I'm not even saying that I'm not a communist. I'm not against people buying homes and expanding them and selling them for a profit. I just don't understand why when you can make the same profit by doing something a little bit more reasonable, why don't we do that? And maybe he has an idea back there.
I'm a preservation contractor, the mayor's former appointee to the Montclair, New Jersey Planning Board, and a member of the Historical Preservation Society there, so I'm very familiar with all the issues that you've been discussing. The key issue is political. You have to put a series of design guidelines into both the master plan and the zoning code. And that requires the political will to force that in. And then you get into all sorts of issues of people being told what they can and can't do with their houses. But without those guidelines within the zoning code, you do not have the controls to determine whether a house is appropriate or characterized as sympathetic, all the loosey-goosey terms. But if you put very specific design guidelines that are created by both architects and historic preservationists, then you can control what is done. That's really the only way to do it with the force of law.
In some
Yes, please.
places around the country now, you know, they're using, to speak to what this man is saying, they're using form-based codes.
Exactly.
So.
That's the term.
It's about staying in the realm of the established neighborhood. So you're not gonna build a house that's taller on the street than anything else, or shorter than any other house on the street. And, you know, if the setbacks on the street vary 5 or 10 feet back and forth, you build within that range, you know? And it's been used quite successfully around the country. But local governments seem to be very resistant to
But I do
society.
think that those have been the best and most successful examples around the
The
country.
question that far back?
Yeah, I have a more general question for the board. And it kind of addresses the same thing. How do you ensure that these important community spots and the fabric is maintained? To what extent do you think that community land trusts and community investments in land are a viable solution in our communities?
Sarah, you want to take this one?
Well, so, there have been, and in Long Island more than other places, around the country even, some wonderful partnerships between open space preservation and, saving historic buildings. So the Conic Land Trust, I think of as an example
Yeah.
out here.
Well, their focus is mostly on open land.
It is, but as a part of that, so, because on Long Island, a lot of the open land that is left has historic buildings on it.
Yeah.
And so what has happened is they have purchased property with the main point being the preservation of the open space. But the bonus to that has been that, they've also preserved historic buildings. And then that's also been used sort of at the county level with Suffolk Community County using, open space money to, specifically save historic buildings. So actually, I'll do a little plug for our newsletter, if you grab it on the way out. The second, page, I think, is all about exactly this relationship between open space and historic preservation on Long Island.
Please go ahead.
The flip side of that is that, there's a great there's a program in South Fork where, any property that's sold that's over $2 million, I think.
I think it's any.
Any now?
Any,
Okay.
yeah.
You pay a small percentage that goes towards a fund that purchases land. And the flip side to that is that it has created an affordable housing problem. Because you're taking land off the plate, you no longer have all that available land to build on. And so the remaining properties become more expensive, and so affordable housing has become an issue. And this goes back to the lack of a comprehensive plan. If you had a plan where you identified every parcel that could be purchased, and so you knew exactly how many acres you've taken off, and said, well, instead, we're gonna designate this, like these neighborhoods, or these areas, to have multifamily housing on them for affordable housing, and discuss that with the community, and so people are all on board. That balance is missing. And I think, when you preserve land like that, you also have to provide the alternative to provide housing, which is the problem we're having right now. Affordable housing is a real issue.
Yeah, and so as part of that transfer tax, there's a new percentage point that's being dedicated towards community housing on
Which is
both
a really
the
good
South Fork and the North Fork. One of the challenges with that, though, is depending upon where you live, there's different levels of control. And so, by example, the village of Greenport has been contributing to this $2 billion pile of money for a couple of decades now, but Southold Town has managed this money for us, and we are not allowed to utilize it for historic preservation like everybody on the South Fork can, nor towards water quality issues. And so that's something that we're pushing to try and change. The gentleman's point about zoning is the most important one. One thing a lot of people here may or may not know is that the village's parks districts, as of right, allow utility plants. So all of Moore's Woods tomorrow conceivably could be converted to a much larger power plant, etc. So this was done, and I think it was 1995. I read through a very interesting legal study a couple months ago that had me on the floor, and that is how the Hoagland Energy Plant was built there. within Moore's Woods over next to the sewage plant. And our village board some number of years ago signed a lease for a potential expansion of that as well. And so this is something that I am very hopeful our board will correct relatively quickly and create a separate zone for utilities from parks, and parks will only be true parks. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to put a permanent conservation easement on Moore's Woods and then make sure that it's protected in perpetuity, because to the gentleman's point, if you don't have the right zoning, things can go awry very quickly. Hence, you know, why we have condos on the water at every place there used to be a working waterfront oyster factory. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this just concerns luxury housing and affordable housing in multi-housing dwellings. New York City has the 80-20, are you familiar with that? Where the developer can do 80% luxury housing, but they have to do 20% affordable housing, which their first priority is neighborhood residents. Do you have a clause like that, city thing?
We don't have anything like that out here now.
Oh, that's just because it's been pretty successful.
Yeah, we have it in Sag Harbor, and that's what we're dealing with right now. That development, what Maziar mentioned before, downtown Sag Harbor, which is a flooding zone, which now a Mr. Potter proposes as this humongous retail and residential housing project. How many square feet? 70,000. 70,000 is what we call the Trojan horse, is 19 affordable housing apartments combined with a lot. That's how he wants to get the foot in, or he got the foot in already, and that's how he wants to make it possible. So that can be also abused.
But the thing you mentioned about the 20% going to neighborhood residents in what's being proposed now will, because it's state would, if it passes, it would be subsidized by the state, by New York State, which means that anyone who wants to live in those so-called affordable homes has to apply to the state through a lottery.
Right,
So
yeah.
it could be anyone, anywhere in the state, moving to Sag Harbor because they end up winning an apartment in Sag Harbor. So it's the opposite of what you.
But the developers also get a break too, don't they?
Oh yeah, they're getting money from the
If they
state.
take that
Yeah,
state
but also
money,
do
there's
they get tax
significant,
breaks and things like that?
there's financial
Sometimes
incentives.
they have to go to school.
Yeah, but not in this, in our town, as long as you have, this is a law that was just passed in Sag Harbor. If you have 5, and, well, by the way, a law passed and a few people in the village sued the law, the village. The law said that if you have 5 apartments in your project, 5 that are affordable, pretty much all the zoning laws will be waived. No setback laws, no parking laws. You could have a 3rd floor, and suddenly, like, carte blanche, like, of course I can put 5 affordable units if you're gonna just give away or take away all these restrictions. So the village was sued, and the judge very quickly agreed with the petitioners, and so that law was struck out. So I hope you don't have anything like that in yours.
We're a long way.
I think you've done a better job.
We're working on things.
I think what all of this is getting at least in terms of historic preservation, is that preservation oftentimes is very reactive. And really it should be the other way. It should be proactive. We should be sitting down saying, not looking backwards, but looking at what is important in our community.
What do you want it to look like in 5
What do we
years,
want
10
it
years,
to
or
look
20
like,
years?
exactly, and how does the preservation of these historic buildings connect to things like the environment, to other pressures, and also not to assume that what is currently labeled as historic and is a historic district is accurate, because oftentimes these studies were done, you know, often, like, a lot of them are based actually on our organization's research, like back in the 70s, so they don't necessarily include the right boundaries. They don't include often, buildings that were owned by underrepresented people, so Black community, other groups. They just were ignored because they weren't seen as important back then. And they may also not include another push on the east end of the island is the preservation of modern architecture, of good modern architecture. And that's disappearing as well. And so really being proactive is the way to go, doing new comprehensive plans that include historic preservation. And a lot of times I think people feel powerless in their community, but it's at the local level where you really have the most power. So if you write letters, if you reach out to groups, local historical societies, groups like ours, and then we can also even connect people to the state level. That's how things happen, and there can be a lot of success if you get involved locally. And you all are here, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but that's, when you're talking to everybody else, that's the message you want to get across, that really you do have the power to create a lot of change in your local environment. You're not powerless.
Who would like to ask the next question? Yes, please.
So I'm a resident of Southold, but not a resident of Greenport. Can I send letters to Greenport saying you should really preserve the
Absolutely.
historical? I mean,
We care about, Greenport's downtown for a lot of people in the North Fork, so, speaking for myself as mayor, I care what the larger community thinks of our community, and frankly, we've got a lot of people whose address says Greenport, they pay a utility bill, they pay sewer through us, but they're not voting members, because they're outside of that 1 square mile, but they feel like Greenporters, and I feel like they are too, so, if you have something to say, please do say it, and feel welcome to come to the meeting. Who else has a question? Nobody?
I have nothing. No, you.
Quick question, because we're just comparison Greenport and Sag Harbor, have you been approached by ferry cruise ships, as we have in Sag Harbor? That is looming large.
Nobody has made any requests of the village or my office, but I have spoken to your mayor about it. I was with them the day that he found out about it, and I know it's a big concern.
Because there are already catalogs peddled with Sag Harbor cruise ship tours, yeah, so just a warning.
It's on our radar. Mario, you have another question?
Yeah, once again, so, I just wanted to make sure that I understood, if we have good zoning rules in effect about what can be built, that will prevent people from, the big developers from outside who don't really live here from doing some things?
No, I mean, nothing
No,
will
so
prevent
that's what
somebody
I
from
wanna
buying
know, how do
something.
we do that?
Zoning protects what can and cannot
I
be built.
get it, but so that.
Money is going to find its way here no matter what.
But if they don't make a lot of money, then they'd be inhibited, or if they have to do things in a certain way.
There are certain things that, I mean, I'm not sure there's a real, I don't know if I have the answer to your question exactly, but I know that, for example, in some townships, the maximum size of a retail store is given. And if you reduce that size to one where a small store could comfortably exist, but a chain store will have a tough time using such a space. That's one way to maintain a small scale fabric of stores owned by perhaps more locally, but then someone from New York City won't be coming here to rent a 500 square foot space, operating it from over there. But if,
That's actually a great point, and we recently updated our waterfront commercial and commercial retail codes. And one of the things that we did, because some of the fears the community saw was happening in South Fork, was we made chain uses, a chain, whether it's Tiffany or Cartier or McDonald's, is now a conditional use and is held to a much higher standard. As well, any restaurant over 1,500 square feet is a conditional use, but the smaller ones are an as of right use, and this was done to try and encourage smaller business. and make it easier for smaller business and less attractive for some of the bigger groups coming out of the city and actively looking out east, and as you've seen, opening throughout South.
Sakara has done that successfully about 15 years ago. We have that long effect, no chain stores, actually.
Who else has a question?
I do.
Yes, please.
Why do you allow a building to be empty with a store that hasn't been occupied in many years? That's a beautiful spot for some other building. Why is that allowed?
So that's a very good question, and something I talked about leading up to the election. It is very difficult to force a private owner to do something with a building. One thing you can do that we're taking a look at is potentially putting in an occupancy tax such that if it sits empty for too long, they would pay a higher property tax. But the best thing you can do is to try and encourage somebody to do something with a carrot as opposed to a stick. And I will tell you, in that particular case, which I think I know exactly what you're talking about, I've met with the owners 4 different times now, and they have started talking to other people about it.
That's good.
East Hampton Village, at some point when the new mayor was elected, was thinking about having arts walks where these empty storefronts would be used as exhibit spaces for artists.
That sounds good.
And artists would love to show their work on Main Street, anywhere. And so he was gonna have all these stores kind of participate in a large scale, like a museum that's spread throughout the village, kind of. So you go from one store to the next. You don't go in, you just walk by the storefronts and see the art.
Southampton
so
did
back-
it for one season.
Southampton
It was
did.
during COVID, they did it, but then they never.
And back to that building you mentioned, I meant to say vacancy tax, not occupancy tax.
I'm sorry.
They have agreed to allow us to work with them to put something up in the windows. And so we are working on that, and as part of a vacancy tax, we would also be taking a look at making a requirement that if your building is sitting empty
It's
over a
such a
certain period of
critical
time,
part of
you need to
the
do some art
avenue.
or something.
It's a big part of the avenue.
Yep.
And it's such a waste, I just,
And boy, could we use a store that, so we don't have to go to Riverhead for clothing.
That's a bigger challenge, and, you know, I have talked to so many people that would love to find a place to buy tube socks and t-shirts, but I mean, Target barely survive these days with Amazon and, you know, the others, so I think those days are gone, sadly.
Say River Race.
Yeah.
But that, the thing is that it's like the 5 and 10, the variety store, the family owns the building. And they're really passionate about it, so most of the old stores, also like, the Wharf Shop, the buildings are family owned. They just want to keep their stores like they have, thank God for them, I mean, it's the.
But if you wanna buy something local, this bracelet is made by an elementary school student at Greenport School, her name's Montiel. She's selling them for $10 at Aldo's, and all of the profits go towards CAST, so go buy a bracelet. Yes, what's your question?
Sag Harbor, though, is one of the last few towns I've ever seen. They can still maintain a 5 and 10, 5 and dime.
Because the family doesn't sell out.
Oh, is that what you mean?
Yes. they
Yes,
own
I
the
mean, most
building,
towns can't do that anymore.
And they.
Not with the dollar stores.
But it's also extremely popular, I mean. the
Right,
amount
it
of
is,
people
and it's
go there,
nice.
The amount, it's one, I mean, I'm there 3 times a day.
But
There was another question in the back, yes, please.
Me?
Yes.
This is for the Long Island Preservation, Society woman. I forgot your name, I'm sorry.
Tara.
Tara. Do you have an outreach program to members of the community that are in houses that don't want to be included in a historic district because they say that it will cost them too much to maintain their house after their stipulations are put on it?
I mean, we don't have any control over what's designated one way or the other. We're an advocacy group, but one thing that what we do, there are a number of tax credits and other, financial, ways forward, and those are at the local level all the way up through the people navigate those and figure out, what is out there. But yes, sometimes preservation is unfortunately expensive. And that is an issue, you know, we see a lot more environmental breaks than we do for historic preservation, and so, groups like ours, all the way up, are advocating for more of those breaks, but we need support, you know, people need to vote for those to go into effect.
Well, also, it would seem that just getting the information out there in a way that informs the community that if your house is put, you know, is put into a historic district, you know,
Yes.
a newly created, you know, expansion of a historic district, that rather than fight it, you know, and, you know, maintain your status as an individualist, you know, that for the good of the community and, you know, the place where we all live, that, you know, that's not something to fight, it's something to embrace.
That is a lot of work, of the kind of work we do too.
Yeah.
So, educating people as to what it means to be listed on the National Register, what you can and can't do. You know, there have been a number of studies, and I'd love to see one done specifically for Long Island, but all of them across the entire country show that being in a historic district actually is financially an advantage for you. Buildings within historic districts are worth more.
And sell-
because they're
and sell for
protected.
more.
And sell for more.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of misinformation out there, so doing that kind of education and working with groups like that is absolutely something
Well,
we do.
I
Well, and
just-
I also sort of feel like it would help that people that live in the historic area now are advocates
Yeah, sure.
for it. And I think in order to get, I live in the historic part of Greenport. In order to get residents who live in the historic area to be more advocates for it, I think some of the subjectivity has to come out of what the historic does, and make it much more pragmatic. So like when you said your idea and you know, you might like yellow, you hate yellow. So it seems like a lot
So
of the
that
work
people
that's.
don't feel they're being dictated to.
Right,
the way
and a
that's
lot of
subjective.
it feels frivolous, at least to me it does, like, it feels like it's not serious stuff, it focuses on things that are very subjective as opposed to things that are substantial and can be easily sort of, you know, put in, I don't know the right words, but, you know, like.
Form-based code.
Exactly, versus, you know, what color's
Well, one of the
important, I'm
things that's
not
really-
saying colored isn't important, but.
One of the things that's really positive coming out of our state, and our state's been one of the leaders in this recently, is in energy conservation. And there's significant financial advantages to things that you might do to change away from oil or change out your siding or windows with, you know, tax breaks and direct financial discounts. And that's something that there could be a lot more communication on, because a perfect example is, as we all know, many of the houses, I have one with vinyl siding that, whoever this schmuck was that came through 40 years ago, sold vinyl siding, we just solve all of everything rotted over. But it doesn't help with keeping the warmth in the house, and so one, you know, if I were to go and wrap my house anew and put wood shingles on it, I would have a significant financial break, and it's something I'm taking.
But I think there are.
Who else has a question? Yes, ma'am.
No, I just wanted to emphasize Tara's point on being proactive and doing a survey. And one of the things that we have today, which we didn't have in the past, is social media. And that's really a good way. You can do a post a day on, you know, this historic building and then the next historic building. And that's a way to educate younger people and get them engaged in, you know, being proactive about the historic district and expanding it. And we didn't mention that, and that is a tool that we can use today. That before, the only people who saw the survey were people, you know, on the boards, or if they were gonna do a project.
Great. Who else has? Yes, sir. In the Adidas shirt? You raise your hand, right? Okay.
I've just been thinking a lot about, sorry, I don't know your name, but the gentleman on what he was talking about just like the kind of pitfalls of historical preservation. I was wondering if there is like a comprehensive plan for making like affordable housing being developed in tandem with like historical preservation, because by itself, historical preservation just kind of will increase the housing crisis and the housing shortage, because it ends up just kind of reinforcing the scarcity. I mean, Greenport and then North Fork as a whole, its housing crisis is a result of scarcity, where we've prevented enough homes being built, not just for middle class and upper class people moving in from the city and like up island suburbs, but just like the local working class and poorer people who also need housing. And like I'm a 2021 graduate of Greenport High School, and I know a lot of people who have already had to move because they've just been priced out of their rentals in Greenport, or I know people who are already just considering moving within like a year or so because they just can't afford it anymore. And I mean, like Greenport's character is like what makes people come here. Obviously there's so many beautiful buildings that need to be preserved, but I think it becomes a problem when, as you said, like we're a square mile, like there's only so much land that we can build on, and that scarcity of land seems to suggest that we just need to start building up and just building more densely. And so how do we prevent historical preservation from getting in the way of that affordable housing when there could be like a designated like affordable apartment for people and they're like, oh no, that goes against the character of the neighborhood. It looks too modern, or.
Well, so this event that I mentioned we did the other night, that I'm sad you weren't able to attend, I'll give you an email and we'll get you on the list next time. We were talking about things that would help partner with potential historic preservation. So a perfect example would be much of our community is zoned for single family houses. And we have a lot of large houses, many of them owned by older people who might not want to keep the entirety of their house. If, rather than them moving to Florida, if they were able to subdivide their house and create another 2 or 3 units out of it, that'd be a way to preserve a beautiful grand house and also end up with some additional rentals as part of it. Another thing that's being considered that we asked the community to take a look at is something called an accessory dwelling unit, which is legal in Sag Harbor. It's not currently legal in Greenport. So many of us have a small garage or barn structure that we can't do anything with other than park a car or keep it in storage. And we're talking to the community about possibly looking at changing the zoning so that that could become a rental. But one of the things to consider too would be to make sure that it is a full-time rental and doesn't become just a short-term rental.
Can we pick
Yes,
up
sir.
on that
Please,
just for
go
a
ahead.
second, just to address this question? The accessory dwelling unit law that was just passed in Sag Harbor about like a month and a half ago, what it says is that you can either build a new structure in your backyard that's as small as 280 square feet and as large as 600. And it can have a kitchen and a bathroom in it. Because previously you couldn't have, in a sense, 2 homes. As soon as you have a kitchen and a bathroom, it's a second home. So now that's allowed. And then there's an affordable housing tax that is soon going to balloon into a very large fund. If you could tie those together, the Affordable Housing Fund ends up subsidizing accessory dwelling units, because even after I researched building a 280 square foot cottage, it ends up costing about $250,000. Like, and this is prefabricated in a factory. 188,000 was the least I could find, like least. So not too many people have $200,000 floating around to build for you to live in. But if this affordable housing fund could subsidize that, and if like many homes who want to have a little 1-bedroom or studio in their backyard, and if that happens a lot, and you spread that throughout, even behind a historic building, this could, I mean, it's worked in other places, and I think this is a good solution.
Yeah, but even with the old houses that are on tight lots, you have an issue when you add bedrooms, that governs the septic. So then.
We're all in sewer, fortunately, in Greenport.
Oh, yes.
Which is a big advantage, although we have our own sewer challenges.
It's pure must.
Yeah. Who else has a question? Did you have one, sir?
It's less than a question and an observation, which is that in the town of Southampton, the place is like a desert at the end of the normal working day, because people aren't living in the village, because they weren't able to put above store accommodation in because of their septic, which has been going on for years, because no one's had the guts to get it done. Because the politician who says that we need to do this isn't going to be alive by the time the thing's built. So you won't get the credit. But so, I don't know what the situation is. Well, you just said you've got your own septic what I'm observing is that when you don't have a lot of people living above the store in a village, you get this feeling of emptiness, and it's very distracting. It puts people off. I mean, I've lived out here for about 30 years, not full time, but enough to get the feel of it. Southampton has sort of, in many ways, not destroyed itself, but has not helped itself by having this vacant feel about it.
Yeah, and it doesn't help when you have retailers who close after Labor Day and say, see you in the spring.
Well, there's less of that now, because the winter idea is busier today than it used to be. And I certainly notice that more restaurants are open now during the winter, by far, than used to be the case. But I just observed that, I don't know what the rules are here, but the more people you can encourage to live above the store, makes the store's business a better business too.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we did also change in our recent zoning, is we converted one area from waterfront commercial, which doesn't allow housing, to commercial retail, so you can now have housing above it. But one of the things that our code committee is taking a look at is potentially a bonus level within our 35-foot height max to allow potentially a third floor if you agree to build a certain amount of it affordable, because that fits within the character. But one can imagine, to your point earlier, looking at a day at some point in the future, 5 years, 20 years, if we have a vibrant downtown full of people living above the shop, our movie theater now open year round, so that could be a very different place.
Sure.
Who else has a question? Nobody? Yes?
This isn't a question, it's a comment, but I wanna point out that this comment from this young man was a really valuable one, because he's saying his generation is gonna move out of Greenport, because they can't afford to live here, and you certainly don't want the young people
We're
of Greenport.
15 years behind where we should be right now, and he's absolutely right. And this is something that we've gotta get the community behind, and we need to move swiftly. And, that's why we are meeting, why we're looking at changing our zoning to allow different things, because we don't have the time to wait another 2 years, let alone 5 years.
Everybody has gone out, it's the same in Sag Harbor, there's most friend of my daughter have moved, if the parents, if they do, my daughter still comes to send there, but they have absolutely no chance of living there.
Yeah, there was a study done just on the North Fork last year, and over 60% of the people that work on the North Fork in peak summer months are all coming from west of Alberton, which is wild to think about.
Well, then you just have to look at, my daughter's at Mattatuck High School, and hardly any of her teachers live out here, including, her science teacher, whose family was here for many, many generations before, she became a teacher. And so it's a real problem. It's a problem that there often also aren't jobs that can support living out here too.
And we as a community need to take a look at a certain level of density in housing in some areas where it might be appropriate as well. We've got a number of them right on the border of Greenport, but not in the village of Greenport, but the town of Southhold, that the town zoning doesn't allow any density of housing, but it allows construction yards and bus yards and a whole lot of other things that could very easily be a wonderful place to build a 30-unit housing complex with parks and everything else.
And that actually can support, our historic areas and historic downtown.
Especially when it's walkable into the village.
It's not something to necessarily be feared if it's not right.
I mean, the preservation does not, preservation and affordable housing is not exclusive, it doesn't contradict each. What really contradicts affordable housing is speculation. Is speculation development, and that's really the source of.
Well, and not in my backyard.
Yes.
And not in my
I mean,
backyard.
I would put that first, actually.
Yes.
If you read the local newspapers, it's nearly all not in my backyard.
What's the plan for the arcade building, or maybe that's what you.
You wanna make a last comment and we'll wrap up?
Well, there's two. One is, I'm concerned that we are not thinking enough about the climate change impacts that are happening and are gonna
my second month in office, I dragged our board down to South Old Town at a joint meeting. I said we needed a climate resiliency plan. Past supervisor agreed to it. He put $100,000 in their budget for it. It was approved by their board, and the new supervisor Kropsky has agreed to work with us on creating one. So now it's about how we get it done.
And I think we should get our town to buy the arcade. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could buy it as a community?
We have a very small budget, and I wish I had the money to buy and do
No,
something.
not you, everybody. We don't want to buy the
Let's focus on the auditorium first. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sally.